Teague, last year it was hard to get a seat in the room to hear your talk. I'm glad we've solved that in a digital way this year. Looking forward to your content.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the benefits of being on Zoom. All right, it looks like we've stabilized at about 100 people. See if more folks may join as we go through, but let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining today. And I'll say again for the folks who just joined, I do have the little grid of faces up here. So if you come on video, I'll be able to see your reactions. I know you had a lot of talks to choose from in this time slot. I really appreciate you choosing this one. I will try to make it worth your while. To start off with, hi, I'm Teague. I've been at Capital One for almost 3 years now. And before Capital One, I ran a product consulting group for about 8 years. I am also a recovering software engineer. You will notice some equations in this talk. They're simple, I promise. But that's also where the title comes from. So why love and data? I think that product leadership, like company leadership, is a marriage of love and data. Warren Buffett says you have to love something to do well at it. And today I want to spend a little bit of time exploring why. But love isn't all you need. We also need the other half of the equation here. Deming said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." One of my favorites. We don't just make wild guesses and hope they work out. We do want both the love and the data. They're both part of the equation here. But I'm not going to talk a lot about data today. Data is hard, but we at Capital One focus on that a lot. So I'm going to focus about 90% of today on love. There is still time to join another session if that makes you a sad panda. But really, when compared to love, I think that data is the easy part. Could that really be right? Yeah, I think that while data may be more complicated is not the same thing as hard. Love, like leadership, is not complicated, it's just hard. And to understand the difference between complicated and hard, I'm going to give a couple examples here. Try telling someone that you're eliminating their position and they don't have a job anymore. Try sitting with someone in pain and being fully present and available for them. Try forgiving someone who hurt you, not just to their face, but in your heart. And then try to understand the numbers in a spreadsheet. So today, let's spend some time on the hard things. Why does love matter for product managers? Corporate America is pretty wary about talking about love. So a lot of executives talk about empathy instead. Maybe it feels a little less squishy, but let's meet them where they are and start there. If deep understanding is what we're after, empathy is the name of the game. Empathy is understanding someone else's feelings, not just intellectually, but by really being able to feel them yourself. And empathy is easier for people like us because it's easier to put yourself in someone else's shoes if those shoes are the same size. But empathy for people not like us is where the magic happens. This is why mediocre product managers design only for themselves, while great product managers can empathize with and design for people very different from themselves. But don't just take my word for it. We're going to hear from a couple of other product managers, their thoughts on empathy. Ryan Siemens, founder and CEO of Groove, a company that has customers including LinkedIn, Intel, Verizon, Ford, says, without empathy, you almost guarantee you will miss out on insights about the best problem to solve and or the right audience to solve that problem for. Product management is like golf. You're rewarded for doing less more accurately, and empathy helps you do just that. Or we can ask Ravi Mehta, former chief product officer at Tinder, who says, empathy is putting yourself in another's place. This is the product builder's job. You must put yourself in the place of all your product's users, not just a single user or persona. It's a failure of empathy to collapse all users into a single persona. As product managers, we are at the forefront of determining how technology products shape our lives. We owe it to ourselves, our team, and our users to make empathy the guiding principle of our work. Or we can ask Ken Norton, who is a director of product at Google for 14 years and led many of the products that you probably use every day. He said, if you're building something for someone else, you'll be much more successful if you can identify with their needs first. But empathy is also essential to leading a team, especially for PMs who tend to have responsibility without authority, and must earn the respect and support of others. And finally, we have Mercy Victoria Grace. She's a venture capitalist at Lightspeed, former director of product and growth at Slack. She said, empathy and product intuition are not immutable traits, even though we talk about them like they are. We describe people as having empathy and having product intuition. This is a harmful characterization because it stops people from learning those skills. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can learn those skills. But first, what is love? Are empathy and love the same thing? Well, I think empathy is really just understanding. And that's a part of love. It might even be the foundation of love. In fact, I think there are three parts to love. We have understanding, intention, and action. And I'd like to call this the love triangle. No, wait, I think that's already taken. Let's call it the love pyramid, even better. Each layer depends on the ones below it and supports the ones above it. Understanding and intention without action is incomplete. Love isn't just a noun, it's also a verb, it's an active endeavor. And intention without understanding is misguided. We think we want or want to do something, but we think it based on false facts and assumptions. And finally, action without understanding can even do harm. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist monk, a peace activist, and he was nominated for the Nobel Prize by Martin Luther King. So he knows a bit of what he's talking about here when he says, loving without knowing how to love wounds the ones we love. Intention by itself is not sufficient. We need to love skillfully, and that takes practice. First, know that this doesn't happen overnight, and we will all fail many times. I can speak to that personally, but don't be discouraged, right? Noticing that you're failing is the first step to improving. But there's danger ahead. There are some warning signs here. And the first is that we've seen a 40% drop in empathy among American college students from 1980 to 2010. That is that American college students are 40% less empathetic than they were 30 years prior. That does not bode well for the country. What if we look at product specifically? In a survey of 1,000 product managers from over 600 companies, when asked what skills are most valued when hiring a product manager, do you see where empathy ranked on this list? That's it, second to last. The companies most represented in this survey were Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Apple, but Capital One also had a pretty strong showing, and we valued empathy less than this average. Okay, so it seems like we have a pretty severe empathy deficit. Can we fix it? Yes, we can. Thanks, Bob. How to develop empathy and love. I'm going to break this down into a set of individual skills and a little bit of how we can practice each of those. You don't necessarily have to do all of them, although you can. There may be a couple that speak to you particularly, and there will be a copy of this deck shared after the talk with any of the links and resources that I mentioned. So first, let's start with skills around understanding. The first skill I want to talk about is emotional literacy, and this is the ability to recognize emotions on a face. Granted, some of this is hard with all of us being in quarantine and talking over Zoom all the time, but there's still opportunities to practice it. The Greater Good Center at Berkeley has an emotional intelligence quiz where they show you a series of faces and ask you what emotion this person is feeling. And then after you answer, they tell you what clues on that face could have shown you what emotion they were actually feeling. The quiz is good for practice, and it gives you some guidance on how to improve your recognition. The second skill I'd like to talk about under understanding is perspective taking. And perspective taking is the act of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, either literally or figuratively. There was an interesting study shown that when students participated in a 24-hour hunger strike, they were then more likely to volunteer at a food bank because they understood what it meant to go hungry. And I want to throw another quote out here from one of my favorites, Brene Brown, who says, in order to empathize with somebody's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it and not how you imagine their experience to be. If any of you were in Samir and Tim's talk just before this, they talked about the platinum rule versus the golden rule, and this is sort of an extension of that. One of the things that we can do to get better at this is we can actually build our own feedback loop, right? Adults can teach themselves empathy. And it's pretty simple, right? There's 3 steps. First, look for signs of emotions. Next, imagine yourself in the other person's situation. And finally, develop a hypothesis and gently present it for them to confirm or correct. That way we learn not just to use the first skill of identifying emotions on somebody, but that we can put ourselves in their situation and get the corrective feedback of whether we have understood their perspective accurately or not. And that's a wonderful skill to develop. The third skill we'll talk about under understanding is moral imagination. Moral imagination is the act of practicing empathy for characters on screen or in books. So when you're reading Harry Potter or whether you're watching Game of Thrones, imagining the emotions that those characters are going through turns out to have a lot of benefit and transferable skills for imagining the emotions that other humans, real humans, are going through. There's a lot of studies that have shown that reading more fiction has a correlation with developing more empathy. If you're already a bookworm like I am, congratulations. If you're not and looking to get back into it, maybe there's a good excuse to get the ball rolling. So these are the 3 skills: understanding, emotional literacy, perspective taking, and moral imagination. So we've got the base of our pyramid here. Next, I want to talk about intention. And the first skill under intention is moral identity. Moral identity is having a sense of what you stand for. It is often talked about as having a mantra. Here's an example of do infinite good could be a mantra that works for some people. But being able to boil down your moral identity, the things that you stand for, the things that you want to influence, to a short phrase that you can remind yourself of often and use as a shibboleth when you're making decisions. I adopted my personal mantra from one of my Buddhist teachers, and I love it because it's only 4 words, but it captures just about everything I value. It is cultivate awareness, love everyone. You're welcome to adopt that one, but certainly everybody has different things that speak to them. So spending some time to find a mantra that works for you is a great way to remind yourself of your moral identity when you're in the decision-making process. The other skill I want to talk about under intention is self-regulation. This takes a lot of forms. It could be meditation, like you see here, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's any number of practices to reduce stress and prevent overload and shutdown and disengagement. It's an incredibly valuable skill, not just because it's been shown to be a better predictor of academic achievement than IQ, but it is also what allows us to continue to engage when things get difficult. And so to continue to have the intention to influence things when situations are hard and when we're burnt out, and like many of us are now, when we're dealing with a more than a year-long pandemic, having these practices for self-regulation turns out to be very important to keep us engaged. There's 2 for intention: moral identity and self-regulation. And that brings us finally to action. There are, again, 2 skills I want to talk about in the action layer of the pyramid. The first of those is simply practicing kindness. Aesop said, "No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted." I think that rings true for me on many levels. One of those is that small acts of kindness can become habits, and the accumulated effect of many small acts of kindness turns out to be a lot of kindness. As you're thinking about trying to build habits, Charles Duhigg's habit loop can be particularly useful. He talks about having a cue, a routine, and a reward. The wonderful thing about kindness habits is that often the reward is simply seeing the impact on some other person. So that part is taken care of. Then we just have to worry about the cue and the routine, having something to remind us to take the act, and having some act of kindness that is easy for us to take, something that makes it easy to continue this practice over long periods of time. And the last skill I want to talk about is moral courage. Moral courage is the ability to take moral action even when it costs us. It is speaking up or intervening when there is a personal risk or cost. This is a picture of Malala Yousafzai, who I think most people are familiar with for her activist work on women's education. She was shot for her activist work in 2012 at the age of 15. Hopefully, none of us will have to face risks like assassination, but we can still be inspired by her example. There are concrete practices that we can adopt to make it easier to take moral action when we are at risk. There's an excellent course from UVA called Ethical Leadership And there is a version of it on Coursera that we have access to through Capital One. There are fundamentally three components of developing moral courage. The first is to focus on positive examples like Malala, to remind ourselves of all of the other people out there who are taking moral action, even when it costs them, because that inspires us to do the same. The second is to construct and practice responses to rationalizations and reasons for not acting in accordance with our values, predicting situations that might come up that challenge our moral stance, like, for instance, the incentive structure at Wells Fargo in the not too distant past, and thinking about what your response will be when someone says, this is good for the business, we should do it. And you think, this is terrible for society and terrible in particular for these customers, we should not do it. Having a pre-constructed response that then the third piece of this is that you practice with your peers is a great way to be ready when that situation presents itself, so that you're not trying to come up with a response in the moment, so that you have something practiced and ready to go, that you can take action and speak up on behalf of the people who maybe aren't in the room. As product managers, we are often in situations of advocating for people who aren't in the room. And so having the responses to rationalizations ready is a great way to make sure that we are able to actually take the action that we intend to take. So here are the 7 skills altogether that ladder up into this pyramid: emotional literacy, perspective taking, moral imagination, moral identity, self-regulation, practicing kindness, and preparing for moral courage. So how do we pair this with data? I promised I would come back to data, and I'm going to do that. But largely what I'm coming back to here is, you know this already, right? Either half is incomplete without the other. Data is what drives the feedback loop. We try to understand, we collect data, and then we get better at understanding. This is something we do every day as product managers. Data also helps us confirm hypotheses. When you do that practicing perspective exercise, and then you ask for confirmation or correction, that's collecting data. It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative, but it's still data. So maybe data isn't separate from love. Maybe it's actually part of it. Understanding comes from data, but without understanding, intention is misguided and actions can do harm. So don't think of data and love as trade-offs. To love well, you need data. And without love, data is inert. Put it all together and you might just create a product that changes someone's life.